So the first thing we'll be looking at are PC components. And we're looking at all the different things that make up a PC that's normally in your home or office. We're going to take a look at different types of storage devices, different types of mobile devices, and different types of connection interfaces. Now, I'm not going to be reading every slide to you, so don't get used to that. Most of these are going to be image-based, and we're just going to be talking about them. Now, this does align with what's in your book, but you'll see that some of the things that we talk about will go a little bit more in depth, especially if I know that they'll be on your test or exam. And some of the things I will be telling you to look in your book for those more than necessary details per se. Because not all of us are going to be memorizing the nitty-gritty details to RAM and the megahertz and gigahertz of all the things that we'll talk about in class, because we have Google to look up those things when they're needed. But you do have to have a basic familiarization with what they mean. So the first thing we're looking at here is just what makes up a computer and how do we pinpoint what device is what. So when we talk about a peripheral device, that's something that we can plug into a computer to interface with it or interact with it. Our system unit itself is what most people call the computer or the tower per se. That's where all the parts are held inside, as far as the motherboard, the CPU, and all that good stuff on the hardware side that we're going to be taking a look at. Display devices, anything you plug in to receive a display from the system unit. Now, this can be a classic monitor like you see. It can be a projector, a television. There's lots of options now. You have input devices, which means anything you plug in that you'll be putting information into your system. So we're inputting information with our keyboard, we're inputting information with our mouse, and we have other input devices that we'll take a look at as well. And of course, we have one more peripheral device. These are optional devices that increase the user experience or improve the user experience while you're on your computer. So being able to listen to music or listen to your YouTube videos as you're watching them, that might take place on internal speakers, or you may have upgraded that and have peripheral devices or external speakers that you've plugged in. So the motherboard is the brains, specifically the CPU of the brains of the computer. And this is where we plug everything in on the motherboard to interact. So everything, whether it's internal or external, that we plug in physically to a computer, to the motherboard. So you'll see lots of different slots and chips and capacitors and different things going on here. And we're going to talk about those in depth when we go across each section of the motherboard. For this section, this is just an overview, so don't get caught up on what is every tiny little thing quite yet, but we will get into that detail. So like I said, the CPU is the brain. You have to know that this is the thing that processes all the data that you have coming in. CPU stands for Circuit Process Unit. So this is where you're going to have all of your data going through and making decisions. Next is our memory, or your RAM is what we are most familiar with calling it. And this is going to be what is in those slots that you saw on your motherboard. And for, say, about 90% of the time, the rule is that these are always installed in pairs. So your RAM, your random access memory, is going to be installed always in pairs. Don't forget that. And we'll talk about different types of RAM when we come to that chapter. Now, all of our data that we're putting into the computer needs to travel from point A to point B. And point B in this section is going to be your CPU, meaning that all the data and decisions, all your ones and zeros, need to travel to your CPU to get processed, and then a response takes place. And that is going to happen on the system bus. Those are the lanes and the speed limits that are going to be applied to our data as we're transferring it in our computer. So all of us need to store data. We used to be really big and reliable on external hard drives, and some of us still have some pretty cool ones in the terabytes now. I remember when 500 gig external meant that you had the latest, greatest, coolest external, and now you can get that on a USB. So we've got external storage devices that we can plug in. They're really fast. They can hold an immense amount of data. We also have internal drives that you see there in the center. And those are going to be the place where we either have a solid state or disk drive that we're saving our information on locally. That means it's coming with us on our laptop per se, wherever we go, or it's stored in the computer. Not something that we're unplugging and plugging back in very often. And then of course we have some USBs and we have SD cards that we're using now. So we'll take a look in depth at what those capacities are and what type of storage devices. But you can have internal or external storage devices, and these are pretty common nowadays. Now, everything needs power to work correctly, and your power supply unit is an important part of your computer. Now, this is one for a tower computer or a full box computer or system, not necessarily for a laptop. That wouldn't fit in any laptop that's made nowadays. But you have different components to these power supplies, including a fan. Some of them will have a voltage switch because we have different types of power or different amounts of power in different places in the world. Of course, we should have a power switch to turn on and off the power in our computer, and we'll need a socket to actually plug it in. Now, everything in IT creates heat. Our CPUs create heat, our graphics cards especially create a lot of heat, and so we need to cool those off. And we usually do that using one of two types of cooling systems. It'll either be an active cooling system or a passive cooling system. Now, active means it has moving parts, and passive means it does not have moving parts. So when we take a look at something called a heat sink, which you see there in the silver, and it has a whole bunch of little slots on it, and I'll point it out here on my screen. So that's a heat sink, and we'll talk more in depth about those, but that's a passive cooling system, meaning that there are no moving parts. Now, of course, a fan does move, and that's going to make it an active cooling system. And you will see active and passive cooling components used together to alleviate heat from different components of your computer. Now, there are hundreds of types of expansion cards, and you can get them for pretty much anything you'd like your computer to do. So whether we are looking to upgrade our graphics card, make our computer wireless. For those of you working on some older or legacy systems, you'll understand that there were wireless cards that we used to upgrade. They may have actually at one point been external, just depending on how old the systems you've been working on. We have audio cards, TV tuner cards, capture cards. There's all different types of expansions that you can integrate into your motherboard. And right there at the bottom where the connector is actually where it connects to your motherboard so that that data can be processed. Now, if you've ran out of places for your cards, you can actually use what's called a riser card. And that's going to allow you to use more than one card on your motherboard, meaning that you can plug in the cards, let's say perpendicular or at a 180-degree angle, so that they're not necessarily plugged directly into the motherboard, but this is kind of like an expansion hub. For those of you who used to run out of USB ports on your computer, you probably got a USB port hub where you can connect one of them into your computer as far as a USB, but then that device would allow you to plug multiple USBs into it. So this is an expansion slot for your motherboard. So you can actually put in more than one expansion card and have it run through one slot on your motherboard. Firmware, there's a million ways to describe it, but I think the easiest way for us that aren't necessarily familiar with it is that it is a very, very tiny piece of software. It's actually a script per se. And these are the instructions that tell every piece of hardware how it can or cannot interact with whatever it's plugged into. So if I have firmware for my keyboard, it is going to tell it that it is a keyboard and what the keys can do and what they're supposed to do. It tells my mouse that it's a mouse. It tells each piece of hardware what is going on. And at any point the manufacturer needs to make a major or critical upgrade, you'll see that they'll actually send out a firmware update. Now, one of the most important things on your motherboard and that you'll interact with in the troubleshooting phase is called your BIOS. Stands for Basic Input Output System. And there is a specific chip on your motherboard that is your BIOS chip, and that is going to hold the information from your BIOS menu even when you turn your computer off. So that's its storage place. Now, in your BIOS is the place where your computer holds the information in regards to where to find your operating system, how much RAM it had the last time and how much RAM it should have at the boot up stage, and the system clock information, among other things. So every single time you boot your computer up, the BIOS is actually what starts first in the background and make sure that all things are okay and all systems are a go before you get to your operating system login screen. Now, the newer version of BIOS is the UEFI screen. It's very similar to your BIOS, but it's upgraded in regards to it looks much prettier, and you can use your mouse in the UEFI interface. You could not use your mouse in the BIOS interface. Now, we talked about to make sure that when your computer boots that it passes all of the different tests, and those tests are called POSTs, or power on self tests. So you've already gotten a little vocabulary. I want you guys either taking notes, making flashcards, or reviewing this in a digital flashcard environment. So POST and BIOS are definitely probably two new acronyms for you, but make sure that you are familiar and comfortable with what they mean. So power on self test for POST and basic input output system for BIOS. So we can take just a few seconds here, and I want you guys to see if you remember what the different components were labeled for our PC. So at first, of course, that's a printer, but what is it actually called in regards to if we're plugging it in or not? What's the vocabulary word for that? We have the next thing, which is the computer. Of course, I'm not using the words they want you to use, so make sure you know the right things here. Then you'll see the screen, we have a keyboard and mouse, and some speakers. So the right answers, or the correct answers, starting with the printer, is it is a peripheral device. Then we have our system itself. Then we have our monitor. We have input devices for the keyboard and mouse, and another peripheral device for our speakers. So take a moment here and see if you can identify some of the components of just the basic side shot of a computer. I'll give you a second to take a look at those, and we're actually going to talk about each one of those in detail today. All right, starting at the top left on your screen, we have a power supply unit. Then we have our RAM slots. We have drives, and we have our drive connectors down at the bottom. We have different expansion cards on the bottom left. And then we have our fan, which is our CPU fan, at the top left. So that's going clockwise, starting at the top. And we're going to take a look at each one of those components as we go through our studies today. And we're going to start with different hard drive characteristics. So there are different types of hard drives, but what I want you guys to see here is that there's a trend in regards to how to refer to them. Now, this is one type of hard drive and one of the fastest that we connect to. And SATA is actually the type of connection we're using for this drive. And I'll show you a picture of a SATA connector at the end of this slideshow. So if you take a look at the SATA 1.5, it is called that because the transfer speed, or how fast it's transferring data, is at 1.5 gigabits per second. Now notice I did not say gigabytes. Look at the B. In GB, it is a small b, and that stands for bits. Take a look at the SATA 3 gigabit per second. You'll notice again the transfer speed matches. Now at the bottom, you have an eSATA, and that's because it is external. The E stands for external. And that means we're actually plugging an external drive in with our SATA cord. Now, there are different types of storage, but solid state is the preferred one of today. We're talking about anything without moving parts. So these are not our disk drives by any means, but these are the things that we're storing data on. None of the parts move, and they're pretty mobile. So our USB flash drives, we all have had interaction. We probably have 100 of them floating around the house or have lost a few at one point or another. They come in different capacities, and those capacities are definitely growing. And we're actually on USB version 3 now, and you may, if you have a newer computer or laptop, notice that one or more of your USB inputs on the computer, the ports, are blue. And that means they're able to read information faster than the ones that are in black. The blue are 3.0 and the black are 2.0. Now, solid state drives means that, again, there are no moving parts. The cool thing is they don't need any batteries or outside help. As long as they're plugged in to your drive, they are good to go. And they are incredibly fast in comparison to our disk drives. Now, some non-traditional types of solid state storage include different types of cards. And we'll just quickly go through these. Some of them were made specifically for different types of digital cameras or recording devices. I know that we have some what we call proprietary cards, meaning that they were specifically for a Sony device, specifically for a Kodak device, and then we have some that are non-proprietary or can be used in different places. So we are used to our SD cards. What you're actually probably used to are your micro SD cards. Those are the really tiny ones that go in your phone, and those things can hold more and more and more these days. We started with 8 and 16 gig cards, which was a big deal. We now have 64 and 128 gig cards, but in all reality, they can go up to 2 terabytes now, which is an immense amount of data. Now, those, of course, are not the ones that are in your phone, and they are not cheap, so you're not going to go on Amazon quite yet and get one of those, but I'd give it about a year, maybe a year and a half, and you'll see those come down in price and be on the public market. So we do have hybrid drives, which means they're combining the solid state functionality with hard drive disk capacities and performance. So you're taking the best of both worlds and putting them together, and we call that a hybrid drive. Now, another way to hold information or store information is on an optical disc. These are CDs, DVDs, and Blu-rays. Now, each one of these is going to have a different capacity, and there are quite a few. We have this slide and one more slide to look at, but it's not that hard when you take a look at the overall and understand the acronyms that are at the end of what you're used to of just seeing a CD or DVD. Now, everyone here should be familiar with, at some point in life, we used to burn CDs. That was a big deal. But you can't burn to a CD-ROM. It had to be a CD-RW, which meant rewritable. Either one of those are going to hold about 860 megabytes at the max, but you'll see ranges of 700, 750. So if you ever asked a question, what's the best place to hold about 720 or 750 megabytes, then a CD would be the right answer. Now, if they're looking to burn or put that information onto the CD, it does need to be a CD-RW. Now, same concept with our DVD. A DVD-ROM, which is read-only memory, cannot be modified or configured. You can't, quote-unquote, burn information to it. But it has a capacity of 4.7 gigabytes, which you can see is a lot more than the few hundred megabytes that we could hold on a CD. Now, there are DVD writables, and there are dual-layer DVD writables, or recordables, I should say, and those have larger capacities. But all of the single-layer DVDs, whether they're rewritable or not, are going to have a 4.7 gig capacity. When you get to the dual-layer, you have an 8.5 gig capacity. And, of course, we have Blu-rays, and Blu-rays hold an immense amount of information, up to about 128 gigs. Now, the only thing you need to remember are those 4 numbers as far as, and I'll go back to the other slide so you can see it here. CDs hold a max of about 850, I would say is a good number to remember, megabytes. DVDs hold up to 4.7 gigs. Dual layer DVDs, 8.5 gigs. And Blu-rays up to 128 gigs. So if I asked you the question, I'm looking to store about 30 gigs of information. What is the best optical storage medium for that? Does it fit on a DVD? Not at all. It's above the capacity for a DVD. So I would have to use a Blu-ray. So we need to make sure that our drives that we're using are capable of reading the types of CDs or DVDs or Blu-rays we put in. Not all CD drives can read DVDs. Not all DVD players can read Blu-ray. And if you have a digital drive that can read more than one, meaning it's a Blu-ray player and a DVD player and a CD player, it's actually what we call a combo drive. And so for those of you who want to stick a Blu-ray in your Xbox 360 and it does not work, that's because it is not compatible. It can read CDs and DVDs, but not Blu-ray. So you have to make sure your drive is compatible with what you're asking it to do. Now, tape drives are something that you probably think are old and nobody uses them anymore, but the fact is we actually still use them every day in big enterprise environments. The US government backs up almost all of its information to a tape drive, and that's because they are safe and they hold all the information, petabytes, exabytes of information. So way beyond our normal gigabytes and terabytes that we're holding in this small office or at home use. They may not look as old as what's on your screen. They may have gotten a little fancier, but we still use this every day, even still, and we will for a long time. So like I said, there's different types of cards. This is definitely a special one. An eMMC drive is all about multimedia, and it's flash memory and making sure that, let's see, the special part of this is that on the same die or in the circuitry is processing and storing the information. So this is not something that you'll see on your test, but a different type of solid state storage that you'll have the option to implement depending on what your job role is and what type of systems you're using. Now, a quick overview on mobile devices. So these are pretty straightforward. You've probably seen and heard all of these words before, other than phablet. Now, you have a laptop, tablet, smartphone, we're good to go. But a phablet is something between a tablet and a smartphone. And the specifics there are it is between 5 and 7 inches. Anything smaller than 5 inches as far as the display is considered a smartphone, and anything larger than 5 inches up to 7 inches is a phablet, and anything above 7 inches is a tablet. So like I said, laptops you're probably pretty familiar with. We're going into the place where most of our displays are touchscreen. So if you're in the market for a new laptop, you will probably end up with a touchscreen display in the near future. And that is or was something that was held for phones and tablets at one point. But of course, we're expanding that technology into the laptop market. Now, tablets are not necessarily something of the past, but I've noticed as our phones get bigger, our tablet sales are definitely decreasing. But just to touch base so you're familiar, all tablets have touchscreens. They have a virtual keyboard on screen, and they are all solid state, meaning that there are no moving parts in regards to their drive or their internal pieces. Now, we have lots of different kinds of phones. iPhone and Android, of course, consume the majority of the market, but BlackBerry and Windows are major players as well. So again, that phablet screen size is there on your screen so you can see. It's a little bit larger than a smartphone, but not quite as big as a tablet. Most of us that have a phablet still consider it a smartphone. So not something you need to integrate into your everyday vocabulary, but something you do want to be familiar with for the test. Now, wearables are expanding by the minute. A lot of us have smartwatches now. Some of our watches are actually a phone in themselves, so they're not dependent on being connected to a phone. They'll have their own phone number. You'll be able to text from them without necessarily connecting to your phone. And you can leave that Bluetooth range, meaning you can leave your actual phone at home and wear it to work or out with you, and you'll have all the capabilities of your normal phone. Now, our headsets, Google Glass, of course, tried, and from what I hear, they're going to try again. But there are different types of wearables out there, but our smartwatches or Fitbits are definitely the most popular. Smart cameras are a thing, and what this means is from your digital camera that you can directly upload to social media or a drive space, meaning that you can store it in the cloud without necessarily having to go home and plug your phone in. You can upload it via a wireless connection and it'll automatically be online. E-readers are still a thing. They're very much like a tablet, but usually the primary difference is that the screen is matte instead of glossed, so it makes it much easier to read text on them. GPS devices have pretty much completely been integrated into our phones for personal use, but these are still in use in enterprise or business environments. So think about all the trucks that you see out on the road, or commercial vehicles, or I'm saying business vehicles, the trucks with the city or state logo on the side. Those usually still have their own GPS system separate from the driver's phone for tracking purposes. So anytime we have a device, a computer or system that we want to plug things into, we need to make sure that we have the ports to do that. And the one port that I want to spend just a moment on and reminding you that exists is this mouse input port right over here. You see the purple and green? There used to be, back in the day, these connections called PS2 ports, and those do not stand for PlayStation 2 by any means. But PS2 ports were our mouse and keyboard input, and we actually used to plug it in here. It wasn't USB. Now we've long since moved past that, but you do need to be familiar with the different types of ports throughout at least the recent history in computing, because you may still see some questions on those. Now for your video ports, you might be looking at what the heck is that? That's HDMI on the right, but what is that thing on the left that has all the holes and is a lighter white or creamish color? Well, that's a DVI port, and we'll be talking about different types of ports when we get to the display section for that. So every port needs to have a cable of some sort, unless it's wireless, and we'll be talking about wireless versus wired connections, but it needs to make sure that you can plug it in on both ends, there's no damage to the cable, and that you plug it into the proper ports on each device. Now, everything you plug in is going to transfer information, and information can be transferred one of two ways, either analog, which is in a waveform, or digital, which are ones and zeros or on or off. And every cable has some type of distance as well as speed limitations, meaning you shouldn't be stringing a 10-foot USB cord around expecting the best data performance. USB has actually a 3-foot maximum range on it as far as reliable communication. Now, some of us use USB extenders, or we got the really, really long cord so we can plug it in on one side of the house and use it on the other side of the house, but you're not getting the most power and you're not getting the best data transfer from there. So let's take a look at a few slides about different types of connections, and then we will end this section. So there are two different types of USB, type A, which you're used to, and type B, which is the bigger squarish one that you probably have no idea what that thing plugs into. You probably have one or two of these floating in a drawer that you haven't opened in a while, and the device it belongs to is probably in a different drawer and you have no idea how to connect it. Well, USB-B, or type B, connects larger devices and multimedia devices. So a lot of times we use those for our digital cameras or our printers. If you had a camera printer, which means you connect your digital camera directly to the printer, usually to print pictures off of it. Those used USB type B. On the camera side, or the smaller device side, it would usually use the mini USB, which is like our micro, but just a little bit thicker. And of course, our micro USB is what we're plugging our phones in with if you have an Android. And if you have an Apple phone, you're using your own little set of proprietary goodness. IEEE 1394. This is one of those things I want you to write down or make a flashcard. IEEE 1394 equals Firewire. It is an Apple proprietary standard or cord, meaning they created it and they own the rights to it. And it's one of the ways where you can transfer information from a device to a system. Of course, our Thunderbolt cords and ports are Apple proprietary as well. And this will transfer display from Apple devices to your system, or from your Apple laptop to a projector. SATA, again, like I said, was a drive connector. So this is the SATA cable, and you'll see that it has a separate power cable, meaning that you do need independent power for your drive. And this is one of the fastest ways we can connect an internal drive to our motherboard for our storage. So this is a storage drive, and this is the connector that we use to connect it to our motherboard and to the drive itself. Different types of connectors for our display. VGA and HDMI are the most common. You've probably seen these. VGA connectors have 15 pins, and that's important to remember because you may have a question about what is a DB15, and that is a 15-pin connector, aka VGA. HDMI connectors actually have 19 pins, but they're very tiny and they're on the inside, so you don't see those. And of course, I had just mentioned that crazy looking connector that you may have not seen before is a DVI connector, a digital video interface. So some of our old school connectors that you need to make sure you're familiar with: RCA cables, which are different, by the way, from RGB cables. So know that there's two different ones there. So RCA or component cables are the red, white, and black, or red, white, and yellow, where RGB cables are red, green, and blue. We have coax connectors here. You'll see an example of a fiber or optical connector. In your home, you're probably using that if you have a sound bar setup. We have an RJ45 or Ethernet cable there. RJ11 are phone or telephone cables. And then those old school legacy PS2 mouse and keyboard connectors. We also have different types of adapters. So anytime you need to plug something in and you don't have that port, but you have a different port, you can use an adapter. And this will allow you to still use a connection that you don't necessarily have the port for on your system, so on your laptop or on your computer. There are lots of different wireless devices that we'll talk about and different connection methods. The most common that you use every day is Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. And so we'll take a look at the specifics for those and get that in-depth information for each of those. But I want to make sure that you guys see just an overview here, and that's what this whole PowerPoint was about, of all the things that you're going to be learning about in A+. Now, did we go over a lot? Yes, we did. But we didn't really go in depth to anything quite yet, and I don't think there was a whole bunch of new information, but probably just a lot of information. So don't let it scare you. It'll definitely be an easy course to get through. You'll be reminded of some things that you haven't used in a while, and you'll learn new things about the devices and components and connections that you're already using every day.